Привет, Владимир.
Hello, Vladimir. So, a lot of things to discuss we have today. First of all, whether St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is indeed an economic forum. We understand it's not international anymore for sure. And also, the central bank rate remains the same. They decided not to increase it, and many commentators take it as a huge event, even though just a month ago they were predicting that it will go down. So many things have happened. Tell us, what did you pay attention to, and what other signals perhaps you're getting from different Russian bureaucrats and the numbers that they're transmitting? Hello, everybody. Indeed, the week was very busy, but I suggest leave the St. Petersburg Forum to the end, to dessert, right? Yeah, let's keep it as a dessert. It was basically a smoke and mirrors event. A lot of people are discussing the escort services provided, what food was served, what presidents from Africa have arrived. But indeed, on this backdrop, there's a lot of other data that tells us a more realistic story. By the way, very interesting fact that at Putin's speech on St. Petersburg Forum, you can actually find his speech on the Kremlin website and look up the word inflation. It is used only 5 times, and every time it is used only in regards to the United States. He has not mentioned inflation in Russia at least once. And yesterday there was also a press conference of Nabiullina, the head of CentroBank, and she has changed her tone significantly compared to everything that was discussed before. Before that, there was some data that a weekly inflation was 0.17% and annual inflation is already significantly over 8. So, if anything, annual inflation is not going down, it only speeds up. And the question to her that we have voiced several times in our studio, where are those mystical signs? And finally, Nabiullina acknowledged that there are no real signs of deflation, and those were just mirage elements, not necessarily understanding or explaining where they came from. And the whole previous year, they were talking about the high central bank rate as a temporary measure to bring the inflation down. And after that, we'll bring it down as well. And the credit rates for businesses will be acceptable again, and everything will be in good shape. Now they're not even talking about that at all. They actually threaten that during the next meeting that will happen on the 26th of July, Central Bank of Russia is very likely to increase the rate significantly. So this is not 1 or 2%, this is more than that. And they already acknowledged that that period of these measures is not a defined period. It doesn't have an end date yet. So I do have a question to her in this relation. All those journalists at her press conference were probably too afraid to ask, but I would ask her a straight question. How do you evaluate the results of the past 10 months? As Bulgakov, the classic of Russian literature, once wrote, "Your poems are great, but you should be telling them yourselves, not writing them." But journalists were too afraid to ask this question, and she indeed is pushing the whole weight of this problem onto budget. That budget is the one to blame, that government is spending too much resources for war, and basically economy is failing to catch up. And it's an obvious situation when import replacement doesn't work, government injects a lot of money into economy, and then they're surprised why the prices are rising. Here she's trying to deflect responsibility, and I think coming back to that decision that they made, they decided that specifically in the day when Putin is presenting his speech on St. Petersburg Forum, if they have risen the rate, that would have a really bad optics. That would have been the main title with a lot of news that day. Right, that was done for political reasons, I understand, right? Indeed, it was. And she actually did push the whole event down to 6:30 p.m. Normally, she gives her speech at 3 p.m. She was obviously waiting for the old clown to complete his speech at the Economic Forum. And if she had presented her new rate or new situation that she was talking about, she would have taken all the main news articles of the day. That would have been a very politically difficult decision for her, so she decided to send the last Chinese warning to Putin that for now we are keeping the rate as is, but if inflation is not going to change during the next month and a half, we will increase the rate significantly. And that's exactly what she said. She used the word significantly, that's over 2%. And I think what she goes here through is that there are no reasons for these factors to disappear, and we can listen to her in her speech. Let's listen 3 minutes. Today we made a decision to keep the key rate at 16% annual. In recent months, we're observing a pause in deflationary processes and in economic growth. The economic data we have do not allow us to predict the scenario that will be taken by our economic development. In the basis, most probable scenario, we still think that overheating of the economy will slowly reduce in the second quarter. However, the probability of a different scenario where it would be required to raise the rate more to address the growing inflation. And the choice between these two scenarios will be the main difference, the main decision to take in our meeting in July. However, in April and May, we got signals that deflation very likely slowed down. In April, current prices went to 6% inflationary rate recalculated for the year, and in May they remained elevated. Partly it was induced by one-time indexation of the prices on vehicles and communication services. However, inflationary processes also continued to grow. Besides that, after 4 months of slowing down, inflationary expectations of our population in May have grown again. Market and participants of the financial market have also increased their prognostications about the growing inflation. All that increases the risks of inflation numbers slowing down not as quickly as we predicted in the base scenario, and actually can feed inflation to stay at the current rate or even speed up. In this case, we'll have to increase our rate. Financial conditions have become harder. Rather significant growth of income occurred on the government loan bonds market. The increase of rates on the money market and profitability of these bonds and the splash on this market is reflective of rather few prolonged expectation of the traders to have a heightened rate and weakened expectation for it to go down. Since our economic stats are running a bit behind, we're paying more attention to operative data that our regional departments acquire directly from companies. Some of them do note the signs of weakened demand and economic activities. For example, manufacturers bring the prices down and also diminish the volumes of their production in metallurgy and in complex assemblies. So we're expecting some branches of our economy to continue cooling down and slowing down. As for the risks, the economic growth tempo will continue to significantly deviate from what we planned. The problem with personnel will continue to stay very strong. We also have the growth of inflationary expectations as a risk, and of course geopolitical risks remain the same. And if all that pressure is not going to disappear in the near term, we are seeing an option to significantly increase the rate in July. Lending and credit conditions will remain difficult as long as we need to address the inflation. So what is going here? She basically confirmed her defeat in this fight against inflation. She was always talking about different factors and ways that inflation will go down. Apparently there are no factors left, right? Exactly. She basically acknowledged that, Michael, without acknowledging it verbatim. But she says that there are no signs of deflation. And she did bring another one in, that the economy is slowing down. The stats are slow walking, but they already have some operative data that on different industries there is a significant slowdown. Vlad, right. Before they were using economic growth as one of the factors. They were saying that yes, inflation is high, other things are difficult, but economy production are growing. But some Bloomberg would then write, well, look, their economy is growing, and apparently this is going to disappear now. Exactly, Michael. This is very natural. They picked two easy factors and tools to use they had. So first is to increase the military production capabilities as much as they could, and they're at the ceiling now. And second, they've chosen the potential for easy import replacement with their own production in some parts of the economy where they can. But further, it goes into more difficult produce and products like automobiles, jets, and the like. And difficult products are too difficult for this economy to produce. They do not get enough spare parts. Even Chinese are not coming into Russia to build any production. And that's where that disconnect appears. The money is being pumped into the economy, but the production lags behind. And why is it lagging behind? Because import replacement with local goods by that Belousov fella is not working. And regardless of how much money you pump, this doesn't solve it. This is an unsolvable task for now, for this mode. If Russia was a usual normal economy, open to the world, that would have international concerns like Airbus, Boeing, and the like coming in and building the factories or participating in this economy. Well, that Sukhoi jet that they're producing was also a product of globalism, right? They're using French engines and some other things, so that's also stalling. Do you know, by the way, the main achievement of Russian automobile maker AvtoVAZ? No, I haven't seen that. What did they talk about? Well, they announced very loudly that besides black, white, and gray colors, they'll have 4 different colors now. Because of the sanctions, they apparently had issues with colors and the tints, but over 2 years of war, their automobile manufacturers finally figured out how to create their own tints. So now we have 4 new colors in Lada vehicles. These are the super achievements of a superpower under Putin. Right, well, even Lada example is also a funny one because Renault and Nissan were also big stakeholders in that business, and when they had to leave, that became pretty difficult for them to exist. And there was actually, I remember there was time when they allowed to produce vehicles without ABS and safety inflating bags. So that gap, that is not going to disappear. We will not have new productions that will be catching up with the growing demand. So that's it. Inflation is forever with us, and no rate is going to overcome it. And it's interesting, it's very symbolically, on the 26th of July, it'll be exactly a year since they've started to increase their rate to cool down the inflation. And if on the 26th they'll have to increase the rate, you don't even need to admit defeat. It's just mathematics, right? Oh yeah, Vlad, it'll be their white flag. Exactly, we'll see. So a couple more interesting topics. First of all, surprise, surprise. We've talked about that here many times. And again, Minister of Finance brought a suggestion to increase the expense and increase expenditures on this year. And partly it is related to Putin's messages and new May orders and directives, and in part it is related to additional needs for social support for those who were fighting in Ukraine or are fighting in Ukraine and their families, and in part it is related to significant expectations for income from petroleum products. They basically threw up the white flag. They concur that there'll not be a price over 70 euros. Last month was traded somewhere near $65 a barrel. And we'll say a few words about what's happening with oil, but basically they're not seeing any perspectives for high oil prices this year. So they lowered their expectation. Their median now goes through 65, and it somewhat matches reality now. And they also see some possible increase in taxation, not related to oil and gas, but their expenses and deficit are planning to grow for $500 billion. So they're previously planning 1.6 trillion rubles deficit. Now it will be 2.1. What is 2.1 trillion deficit? Is 40% of remaining amount in the Fund of National Security, the liquid part of it. So if they spend more than 2 trillion for budgetary needs until the end of this year, then for the beginning of 25, they will have less than 3 trillion rubles in that fund. You understand, Michael, that this is somewhat disappearing cushion, and we're basically at a spot when they run out of money. But we are yet to achieve that, and we have not seen the budget for the next year yet. That'll likely be published at the end of August, beginning of September. That's where we'll see a worse picture, that they need to continue increasing expenses, first of all, to continue this war, and situation with incomes is rather pathetic, both due to oil prices and due to the economy stalling overall. So an interesting point to observe will be at the beginning of autumn, when we'll see the whole picture after the battle, so to say. They were holding and holding, but the moment when they're running out of money, that's when it comes. And in conjunction with that, there'll be, of course, a question raised, I suspect, that they'll need to soften financial politics and probably fire Elvira Nabiulina and go to the field of emissions, additional printing of money or additional emissions. And they try to gather more money from the taxation. Right, the only thing I think they'll squeeze out of this economy is the desire from the entrepreneurs to continue running their businesses. Exactly, Michael. And I expect that to be rather soon. Theoretically, it's a September timeframe when the country is running out of money, and people are saying that Putin will probably print more money. Of course, he can try to go this way, but this will have significant and long-term consequences. And I wanted to say something about oil market. All these events were too many things happening this week, right? All the different elements. On the 2nd of June, there was another of OPEC gatherings, and it gave very weak results. The oil actually went lower than 77. Why? Because they extended those quotas for limiting the pumping, but this was already priced in. The fact that Brent was costing above 80, everybody were expecting them to continue that. But what's important, they didn't punish or at least reprimand anyone for cheating, and that's one of the factors. At least half of the OPEC countries, they continue pumping regardless of any obligations they sound. And then they said that starting the Q4 of this year, they'll start lifting all these quotas. So all these attempts to regulate the market by the OPEC countries they're coming to an end, and we can see now the prices going down. So Putin cannot rely on expensive oil. There are no factors in the world that could affect that price significantly. And that's it. 1 year plus of OPEC attempts, and the final is rather predictable. I think those who are watching our streams, they generally understand that. By the way, a side note here on the borders, that, you and I very often run into some hate comments and stuff. What do you like, Vlad? Really, if you follow through with different stories that we've been tracing throughout the year, since I'm working with him weekly, I remember that when everybody were screaming that the oil prices are going to increase, they'll be hitting 100 and above, Vlad was calm and saying, no, this is just pumping and dumping. They're just pumping up the market. Don't worry, it will not go too high. And now we have the spring upon us, and as the saying goes, the spring shows who shat where. So the prices are going down, and world media are now reflective of that. See, I had my encounters with the world media and what they write. I am not even surprised by the different inadequate things that they publish. And finally, I've seen the day before yesterday, one of the bigger publications, that Russian offensive failed, and it's not according to the plan. I'm actually surprised because usually they're writing asanas to Putin. And same thing, when on St. Petersburg Forum, we start hearing statements much closer to reality and less optimistic than in the Western media, in the Western press, who often write how rainbow and ponies and fantastic economy is doing under Putin. When Nabiulina and the Economic Forum is talking about 4% inflation, the whole audience is laughing. Nobody is pretending anymore. But yeah, indeed, Michael, we'll actually see that. I did pick that video for our later part in that stream. But the story is true. We've been producing these videos for about 2 years now, and you can rewind and you can see what did we say about one or the other. And sometimes we're mistaken. We review those mistakes and we acknowledge if we made a mistake somewhere. But as a general rule, we are good at catching the vector, and we're indicating you where it goes to. And you can see that on inflation. For over a year, we had that discussion with Nabiulina via different proxies, and well, guess who was right? By the way, I've also released a new video about China on my channel, and let's talk a little bit about China. There were several episodes published last week, several publications and videos about Russia and China economic relations, and they're all talking about that picture is not so rosy. I just came back from Washington where I was telling people, do not trust your think tanks and do not read your press that are telling you that Putin controls everything. Just read and listen to what is published in Russia. Chemezov, Mantarov, Grev, other figures. You'll get a very different picture. Oh, absolutely. A very schizophrenic situation, Vlad, when Western publications are saying that Putin stuff is fantastic, and inside Russia, they're talking about we're in deep shit. Right. That happens, Michael, because he is good at smoke and mirrors. He can pretend to be a thug, and you remember that cartoon, like that snake in Mowgli and the monkeys? That's seemingly the effect he has on the Western media. But speaking of China, there were a couple interesting moments. Negotiations about the Power of Siberia 2 have hit a dead end. We did talk about that in numbers, China does not have a need in a lot of natural resources from Russia. They're already importing a lot of liquefied natural gas. They signed a huge contract with Turkmenia, and additional 100 billion cubic meters from Russia. They don't know what to do with it. They don't have demand for it. And that's why very likely there will not be any agreement. And FT basically signs that, saying that nothing new, nothing exciting is to come out of these negotiations. And we also see a huge increase in logistics prices. We see that China has increased the price of container transportations by tens of %. And this is related to the fact that everybody started shipping through the Cape of Good Hope, avoiding the Red Sea risks. And that increased the duration of use for each container and decreased the reserve number of containers available. So first of all, Chinese companies reacted to that and increased the pricing for container itself, for renting the container for transport, and by 50% actually, if you get all together. And 50% for transportation expense, that's very painful for Russia at the moment, given that China is a main supplier of a lot of consumer goods, and every week we get news about significant increases in logistics costs. And that raises a lot of question whether it will even continue to be profitable or not. A lot of data coming from China, economy related, and they fail to fly. They fail to take a wing. In May, their index, the industrial index, went lower than 50%. And basically it talks about the fall of entrepreneurship assuredness in the future of economy in China. So Xi Jinping fails to light Chinese economy, light the fire under it. And this is one of the main markets that Russia is oriented to today, and that market is weakening. There is no way to get there with Russian goods. I'm not even talking about that. And I did post, as I said, a new video about China on my channel, and I do go into the weeds there. And as we understand, China is not going to save Russia. A couple more things before we go to St. Petersburg Forum. Russian Stat published a big volume with April data, but not to go into details, everything sucks. You can look at the graph. This is information on real sector. Industrial production is slightly growing. It's less than 4%, but for the most part, it's military production. Agriculture production barely above the zero line. Transport is in a serious minus. So real sector of economy feels itself pretty bad. And that slowdown that we talked about, you can actually see it now in numbers. I will give more numbers in the next stream, not to overload you now, but finally, Putin, for example, is saying that they will index the pensions for the retirees, and real pensions with a correction to the inflation are in the negative now. The numbers are decreasing since the end of last year, and this year, despite of so-called elections, there was no real indexation. The pensions are still in the negative because they were calculating them with inflation at 4%, and inflation is very different from that. Do not forget to support that video with your like and subscription to that channel and to Patreon and the other channels. And if you're listening or watching that in English, don't forget to support PrivateerStation. Okay, let's go back to Vladimir. Gasoline, they stopped publishing data on the production. We'll see how maybe in bi-monthly frame we'll still get some data, but we're getting some growth of retail prices. And it'll be difficult for them, I think, to hold them because it costs a lot that gasoline damper cost them actually much. These are all pretty words, but budget is paying to the oil industry in order for them to hold oil prices and gasoline prices in Russia. And they actually increased these payments, right? They've paid over 200 billion rubles a month. And that was in May. That's a lot. You can see how much was paid during the previous year, starting since 2021. Over 3.5 years, Russia paid over 5 trillion rubles to the oil sector in order for them to not increase the gasoline prices in the country. Wait, Vlad, I don't understand. Who's supporting whom? Russia supports the oil industry or the oil industry supports Russia? That's a big question, Michael. Because people think that Russia lives on the oil money, and many times, time and time again, economists explain that the main income source in Russia is the taxpayer. They're paying VAT, they're paying all the other taxes and social taxes and other federal and regional taxes, and all that comes to much more money going into the budget. 5.5 trillion were just taken and given to the oil industry not to increase gasoline prices. We understand that they cannot continue that for long, and they've been discussing that fuel damper, as they call it, in Putin's government. And the market will work rather straightforwardly here. If they cancel that, there'll be a sharp increase on gasoline prices, probably even doubling the cost at the retail. But you can tell that on this huge number, 5 trillions, that they do have to burn a lot of money to maintain some status quo. And right, this was even before the military conflict, right? Right, before the war. Now they have to spend over 200 billion rubles monthly. And the oil industry is getting money from the budget. That's a fantastic story, right? So they're not in the situation where they can afford it in the long term. By the way, speaking of our previous discussion, there was another attack, another hit on Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery. My sources are telling me that part of the employees were sent home for 3 to 4 months while the repairs are being carried out. I cannot verify that. It's just hearsay that comes to me. If anybody is working there, please reach out and let us know directly. But I think Vladimir was talking about the strikes on oil refineries too. Right, Michael, but Novoshakhtinsk is not a big factory. So when we're talking about all these oil refineries in the south and Krasnodar district, they're rather small volume production. The bigger ones are Nizhny Novgorod, Volgograd, Moscow, Ryazan, Yaroslavl. Those are juicier targets. But I think if the trend continues, it will continue hitting even bigger too. Okay, now let's talk about St. Petersburg Forum. Let's talk about economic part, not about the decorations and other things that other publications like to discuss. Let's start with Putin. His statement was absolutely blank and bland. And right, he said we overtook Japan. Right, it's shameful, Michael. Just listening to him, it's some parallel reality beyond any reasonable thought. And I have explained many times on potatoes what is the purchasing parity. To explain it once again, using that number that Putin is operating with. If you have a wooden outhouse in the yard, in the backyard, and if you have a good proper toilet with the proper canalization and hot water, by that parameter, they are the same because you get the service. This way you can overtake not only Japan, but also America. So that indicator is looking basically at a very simplified function. How many calories a day you're getting from some. So they don't care about how you get it, via eating potatoes or you're eating via medium rare steaks. That indicator doesn't care. It's not even funny. So we have taken over Japan. Fantastic. Okay, who's next? China? America? And I am suggesting a very simple test here. Any statement made by Putin, and they're all published on the site of Kremlin, just run for some keywords. For example, tax increase, 0, nothing, not mentioned once. Inflation, mentioned 5 times. If you type the inflation in the search, you find that it was used every time only about the United States. In regards to the United States and their economic process, that inflation is high there. He is not saying a word about inflation in Russia. 0. We don't have inflation. And meanwhile, Elvira Nabiulina is sitting somewhere in the background waiting for Putin to conclude his speech so she can hold her press conference on the CentroBank rate, because we do have inflation, whatever Putin is telling in his fairy tales. He's also talking about some indexation of pensions. Real pensions are in negative. He's talking about investments, and then in a parallel session about economy, we'll give you some fragments. Everybody is talking about which investments when you are increasing taxes and expropriating property. So this is some parallel world of pink unicorns that he lives in. I don't even know whether I should laugh or cry in this case, or get angry. But what's the most striking in his speech, that last time they said that they canceled a zero income tax for IT workers, and he now presents that as an additional bonus. He's outlining that, look, everybody else are paying 25%, you're paying only 5%. So he treats it as a bonus to IT companies. He doesn't care that he actually just had risen it from 0 to 5%. And one more thing for those who work in Russian economy, he's also saying, probably a scary thing, he's saying that they'll be transferring all the key companies to the Russian software. He gave an order that at least 80% of software in the main industrial companies and main production should be used Russian software. So we've seen the issues with SDEC software last week, right? When 2/3 of companies are saying that cybersecurity infrastructure in Russia is near zero. It's non-existent because Russian software developers do not really have a practice of providing good cybersecurity for their products. So if they're switching 80% to Russian software, there'll be more issues. Right, they'll either start using gray licensing from the Western software companies, or they'll be stalling and breaking. Indeed, Michael. So there's nothing else economically viable in his speech, by the way. You know, Vlad, I noticed another thing. The West is starting to pay less attention to Putin's speeches now. Since if you notice that he talked for 2 days about different things on this forum, and since he's not getting enough attention, he's starting to throw different topics to stir the attention. Like in that St. Petersburg Forum, amidst the economic issues, he brings up the matter of why everybody thinks we'll never use nukes. We might. What if? And another interesting trend is that his pro-Putin's Z channels, that pro-war channels in Russia, they're actually starting to rumble. They're saying that he's not addressing mobilization proper, he's not conducting the war proper. So he's actually getting some flack from that side of political spectrum in Russia. And he's now screaming about nukes on occasion. We're waiting to see when he'll eventually start saying, okay, we're done, let's give up. Right. It's difficult, Michael, to comment the person who keeps lying, right? Back in the day, decades ago, there were elements of reality in his stories, sometimes. But now, I think I'm quite sure they're taking every phrase through some parallel reality filter to make sure there is nothing real in it. So I'm still irked by that moment on the tax benefits for the IT sector. He's saying that they set the rate to be at 5%, and he's promising to fix it till 2030 and will not change it under any conditions. What the F? He just a month or 2 months ago was saying that they're not going to increase that tax ever. And now it's up 5%. So who's going to take him seriously after this? There were more interesting allusions there at the St. Petersburg Forum. I would pay attention to Monterov, first of all. He acknowledged the number of the personnel deficit to be true, and he said it's 160,000 deficit. This is a foobar. In the current trends and the current tendencies in Russian economy, by 2026, they're expecting it to be 240,000. This is a very significant part, very significant headcount. So that you understand, it's 660,000 people working in Rostec. Out of them, 400,000 is military part. And Rostec is roughly about 80% of manufacturing capacity by volume. Not in the cost expression, but by volume, what is produced. Arms, shells, military equipment. So, right, maybe 1 million overall. 160,000 deficit, and it'll be 240,000 soon. So a quarter of positions will be unoccupied. What new wave of mobilization are we going to talk about in this light? When you look at this vacancies and amount of vacancies open, you can see that military production complex is one of the biggest spheres that suffers the most from the deficit of cadre. And that given that they're paying a lot more than other sectors, even to the low qualified specialists. You'd think that probably they don't have enough people because business took people and they're paying more. But it's not so. We know that military complex actually stole a lot of people from businesses, and it still is not solving the problem. They don't have a solution for it. Right, this is an unsolvable problem for them at this moment, because even to prepare an engineer who can work on a complex production, this is a big issue. You cannot do that in 2 or 3 years. And I continue reading some Western analysts how Putin has everything under control in his military sector, and he only needs to fine-tune that in the face of new figure of Belousov to be successful long-term. What fine-tuning are you talking about? They're going on all the parameters through the deepest crisis in their production. And then General Prosecutor Krasnov in Russia, what I like about it is that here in a new paper in Europe, they summed that 100 companies were nationalized in Russia worth of more than trillion rubles, and everybody are saying, well, it's horrible, it's nationalization, right? General prosecutor in Russia is actually boasting. At the interview on the St. Petersburg Forum, he was bragging that 130 companies with a total assets worth of 1,300,000,000,000, he said that they will continue. And I'll give us some clips from that economic session, how Makarov, who is the chair of the Committee on Budget and Taxation, he's saying that I'm a bit scared that our prosecutor's booth is closer and closer to our session. Right, Vlad. Everybody is still scared that Maria Pevchik and Navalny's group will come and take away all the Putin's cronies' owned companies. In reality, it's their district attorneys and prosecutors who are already taking that away from them. Right, I'm baffled by these discussions, like how these collective Movchans and others are saying that if you bring the minimal salary up to 25,000, everything will crumble. Well, look, the nationalization is going, and the minimal salary keeps growing, and Maria Pevchik is somehow still a thing with Putin's cronies, that they're still afraid of Navalny people. Grev, another figure in Putin's government, made a very strong statement. On the 4th, he had a statement made in the Federation Council, and then he was at that St. Petersburg Forum, and he's very grim about economic prospects of Russia. He's saying that economy is overheated. What is overheating comprised of? Is when you throw a lot of money into economy, but production and import replacement is not catching up and cannot catch up because you cannot really build anything with what you have. And all these monies then reflected in the growth of price. Right, so these monies, they really do not reflect anything real, right? That differs from printing know-how. It is the same in essence. And if you once again remember the picture of 20-year-old when there was a big influx of money into Russian economy, but it was consumed by business activities. People were taking these monies. How normal economy would sterilize these excess monies? They would be taken and invested. And that's how you direct these extra assets into capital equipment, into new facilities, you make new factories, you create new workplaces, you create new jobs. Right, so that's the proper growth that slows down the inflationary process when you sterilize money via investing them in the long-term projects. Right now, that is not happening. And all the money are going to the consumer market, resulting in inflation, causing that overheating. And it's interesting that Grev acknowledged that central bank measures are cooling down the economy, but they're not cooling down the inflation. And I will humbly return back to the formula of Michael Nacke. Watch our videos. We told you about that about a year ago. When central bank started to increase that rate, we predicted that that's exactly how it will happen. And now it's official. I think it'll be eventually in some books somewhere. But yeah, we are the trend starters. So to conclude, I won't even speak much. I'll give you a piece from St. Petersburg Forum. It's a rather big segment. It's 6.5 minutes. But that's when everybody were discussing Putin and the escort girls. There was actually a main economic session happening where Sulanov, Nabiulina, Minister of Economy, Reshetnikov, and Oreshkin, aide to Putin, who is a deputy head of his administration. This is the usual panel. And its moderator, Andrei Makarov, who is the chairman on the Budget and Taxation Committee in Russian Congress. Listen how he is punning them, how he is making jokes at their expense. He's basically telling them, you promised us you will not increase taxes last year. You promised us there'll be no nationalization happening. It's breaking code. What investments are you talking about? I really like his story about the economy of a closed cycle. I'm thinking he might get noticed by pro-Putin's media. He's actually very pro-Putin himself. He is for Putin's party, but he has a very colorful biography. Under Brezhnev times, he was an aide to Churbanov, a relative of Brezhnev who was taken for corruption, and he was basically defending him from different criminal prosecutions. Then he was leading Soros Fund in Moscow at the beginning of 90s. Then he was in Gaidar's Choice of Russia party, and then he left it and became a very distinguished Putin's party representative. And this is a good picture of Putin's elites, how they all migrate from Soviet Brezhnev to Gaidar and the economists and then go to Putin's gang. And here's one of the brighter moments at this forum. And this is being said at the forum, the biggest economic forum in Russia. This is what they really think and what they really understand is happening. So the government first gives money to produce product, then the government gives money to make sure that somebody buys it, sponsors it, then government gives money to build a warehouse because you need to store it somewhere since it was not purchased much, and then the government gives money fourth time so that product would be utilized because storing it in the warehouse is too expensive. So-called economy of a closed cycle. Every year, prosecutors' stand is getting closer and closer to our session here. Right now, it's right there behind the corner, so I'm quoting things here only because Maxim told me to quote. All right, increasing taxation on business is counterproductive. We'll lose more. That's true. Simple increase of taxation for business is counterproductive. Okay, I'm not going back to the privatization matters. In the argument between Kostin and the head of the investigative committee, we now understand that it is the investigative committee and enforcement agencies who had won. Last year, some people were concerned and didn't have a winner in their mind. I don't know which one of them were optimists. So a question here. Makfa, for example, they're the biggest macaroni manufacturer in the country. Do I understand it right that now we'll be producing federal macaroni? I mean, it's a good idea, right? Federal macaroni, high quality. Or Solikamsk magnesium factory, the rights of minority shareholders. The shares of this enterprise were traded at Moscow's stock exchange freely, and the major stakeholders have lost their property. Now the prosecutor's office of Perm district also requested to take away the remaining assets from minority shareholders. I think it's only about 200 people, about 10% worth of this company, but I think I'm correct with numbers. So I have a question, and it's not, I'm trying to be careful because the prosecutor's booth is right next door here, and I'm also somewhat afraid. But how do we go about the civil code, which forbids explicitly to take away the stock that was acquired at free and open trade, and so that nobody accuses me of making false statements? There is a 149th article, paragraph 3, I would even read it. Stock options acquired at a stock trade cannot be withdrawn, cannot be taken away from stock owners. So if I may ask here a question, where should the government end and where should private investments be honored? Maxim started here with the question of trust, right? It matters. So do you think actions like this, they actually grow any trust of private investors, that they would continue investing money into our companies unless he is forced to? That's a question to you. I understand it's easier to discuss optimists and pessimists. Why are you asking these questions of me? Well, you said at the very beginning that one of the main things that happened during the last 6 years was the build up of trust. That's what you said, not me. And I'm posting a question here whether we can talk about the trust of investors or the growth of trust of investors, because you cannot have any investments when there is no trust. In today's state of our institutions in the country, we're talking about different things, but we completely forgot about different institutes, about respect to private property. Now it seems it's forbidden to discuss independent court and an ability to acquire some court protection, and the court protection for investors arguing with the government. That's a very important factor. These institutes. Do you really think that today these institutes are matching the tasks standing in front of them? And you also talked about, Elvira, about the trust to financial system, but you also had a second part of your statement where you said that financial system has to rebuild itself to serve and service the stable growth. Yes, I did. So did it? And you brought a couple examples. You brought a taxonomy as an example. So running forward, not to discuss the details of it, it didn't take off. It failed, right? I agree with you. It did not. That initiative didn't fly as we intended. Also, I have a really bad character. Could you please elaborate on your KPI? Because when you're talking about investments, KPI is a slogan. It's like peace, labor, and May. It's difficult to argue with that because peace is better than war, labor is better than unemployment, and May is better than rainy and cold November. So what are you including in your KPI besides slogans? Well, real tempo of growth of investments, right? Real investments, okay. When we'll see the number, we'll learn. Because the meeting here, our assembly members have questions whether what you're talking about actually has any positive KPI there. And some people are saying that we surprisingly have a pessimist on the panel, and Minister of Economic Development cannot be a pessimist, right? Well, we do have a 10% growth of investments, right? It's not a sign of pessimism. Right, exactly. That's why I'm asking about the next year, not about the past year. You cannot be an optimist last year and be a pessimist for the next year. Or is it so? Elvira, what do you think? Well, inflationary goals we're trying to meet them. We're trying to keep our inflation at 4%. Elvira, have you thought through the statement? So see, even nothing to comment here from me. These commentary from moderator Makarov to this economic session, you can see how they all are looking somewhere on the floor and asking, why are you asking me these tough questions? Everybody understands everything. And this is official. This is the highest economic leadership of the country who were present at such a rather pathetic conversation. They were basically beat up there. And they did boast with some achievements. By the way, Areshkin also brought up interesting topics there. Watch it. You can find it online. And we do recommend you to always check with the sources. But the main conclusion from this is that everybody there understands everything. All these conversations that Russian economy is stable and it's resistant to sanctions and it's growing faster than others, this is for the fools. All that Western media, I don't know why they're running following Putin and cheerleading him and telling how fantastic his rule is. Here, check it out. Russian officials are making rather obvious statements how they gauge the current situation. And that's it. I think these were two major things. One thing to continue here, I want to say that Aeroflot acknowledged that they will have not enough passengers in the next couple of years. There'll be 5 million passengers less than usual because they are not going to have enough flying jets. That's a very important aspect because Western jets are too difficult to repair, and they're slowly waning out of the process. And what Chemezov promised, those Russian-made jets, right, I do, those are my favorite. They're still standing, right? They're not flying. Exactly, we don't have any of those super jets. And Aeroflot is predicting that it will hit the passenger transportation. That implies the growth of ticket prices and the decline of aviation transport and it becoming less affordable. So that's Russian manufactured things to replace the foreign ones. Also responsibility of Belousov before he was appointed, right? I'm also watching some experts, Vlad. They were talking that Belousov will come and will bring things to order, and now they're somewhat not so happy, especially those Z channels. They initially were so giddy about him. When he started repeating Konashenko numbers, they continued to hope. Then he ignored several meetings with them, and he did not call upon them to meet with him. So especially that he's filtering those who can be somewhat critical, and that he jailed several good generals with the bad generals. And all this pro-war party is not seeing any positive change, and they're not really happy about his appointment. Well, again, guys, watch the whole system, not significant individuals within it. I think the whole thing that Belousov was in charge of import replacement, that's a verdict enough. Just look around and try to find that import replaced goods. And if it's the best cadre that Putin has, I have some bad news for the fans of Vladimir Putin. Right, and now with this failure on the Kharkov district, failure of offensive there, I think now the pendulum will swing in a different direction, and I think they'll start screaming. It'll be rather entertaining to watch. And now the bank rate will also grow. It'll be a very interesting next couple months in summer. Other moments, ruble was strengthening last week, and many people are asking me, why is that happening? I think it is happening because they're blocking imports from China, and certain payments are blocked because of the secondary sanctions. You can watch that in my other video. I'm saying there that Putin fails to unblock these payments, and basically that means that currency is still hanging because they cannot pay it for the imports, and the imports declined in the first quarter by 10% according to the Russian stat. But we see that by the end of the week, ruble, during the whole week, there were headlines saying that it's increasing, it's strengthening itself, but by the end of the week it creeped up to the 90 rubles per dollar again. On the overall news about a lengthy, difficult economic times coming that Elvira outlined. So don't worry, ruble will fall and continue falling for a long time. I think this week was rather saturated with news. Next week will probably be a bit lighter from all these bright elements, so we can talk in more details about additional information and statistics. We'll find what to tell you about. Continue sticking with us. You know, Vlad, every time you say nothing is going to happen next week, there's usually a whole wave of things coming. But anyway, thank you so much. Until we meet you again. Till later.